O'Neill, your time has expired. Senator Reynolds.
Thank you very much, Ms Acting Deputy Speaker. I rise tonight with a great deal of pride and a great deal of emotion to share my family's pilgrimage to Gallipoli for the centenary of Anzac celebrations. On Anzac Day this year, hundreds of thousands of Australians and New Zealanders came together all over the world, not to commemorate victories or defeats in war, but to honour and remember the courage and selfless sacrifice made by our servicemen and women, both past and present. My grandfather, Alfred George Reynolds, was one of the young soldiers who departed Albany in the first convoy on the 1st of November 1914. He was a 3rd Field Ambulance medic who, against all the odds, served not only throughout Gallipoli but throughout the Western Front, Fromelles, Somme, Pozières, Ypres and Amiens. Unlike so many of his mates, he did return alive. He returned home in good physical health, but terribly mentally scarred. My grandfather rarely talked about his experiences and neither valued nor kept reminders of war. After the war, he went on to do many things in his long life in Western Australia. He married twice and had 7 children. He was a wool classer, a sheep and wheat farmer in Muckenbudin, an accountant in Albany, and even a politician in state parliament, a Labor politician. His story is one of many now shared in the Albany Anzac Centre. My dad, Laith, and I were 2 of the very lucky 10,000 Australian and New Zealanders who were successful in the ballot for the opportunity to participate in the Gallipoli Centenary commemorations. Joining us were my brothers Andrew and Cameron. This was my first organised tour, and really none of us were sure what to expect on an 8-day bus tour, finding out when we got there that we were 4 of 2,000 others booked with this particular tour operator. But they were up to the challenge, and my family and 20 other Aussies and Kiwis became bus A214 for the duration of the trip. We were a wonderfully mixed group over the course of the trip, sharing our diverse and interesting family stories with each other and others that we met. After the official commemorations had concluded and the world's eyes had moved away from Gallipoli, my family and I continued to tour the battlefields and the war cemeteries to gain a much greater understanding of the Gallipoli campaign. We were very fortunate on our bus to have the award-winning journalist and author Chris Masters as our historian. He skillfully brought the campaign to life with not only his own knowledge but the voices and the stories of so many diggers. Our irrepressible local Turkish guide, Sukru, also provided us with thought-provoking and alternative points of view. Many tears were shed by myself and all others at the wonderful and moving ceremonies at Anzac Cove and at Lone Pine. It was a trip we will always remember and we will always cherish as a family. It has also now given me much to reflect on as a senator. As a family, we were hoping in Gallipoli to gain a greater understanding of what my grandfather may have experienced and fill in large gaps in our knowledge of his 4 years at war. We have fragments: his utter dismay at the Simpson legend and the mythology that arose, his extremely unfavourable impression of Pommy officers, his belief that shell shock was a medical condition and not cowardice, and his very keen appreciation of French women when he was on leave. But in retrospect, the most visible evidence of war, which bewildered his children, was his anger and his lifelong battle with what we call today post-traumatic stress disorder. My own memories of my grandfather are scant because he was already old when I was a child. Sadly, he passed away long before I was able to ask him the questions that I and now other family members have. But one of the most wonderful things I will always remember of the trip is the stories that we shared with each other, not only my own families, but also the stories of everybody else there that we encountered. Strangers shared their stories on aeroplanes on the way there, in cafes, in hotel lobbies, and on the grass at Anzac Cove and Lone Pine. It was evident we all had a very strong and common bond, and our pride as descendants of Anzacs was very clear. While many said that they made the pilgrimage to honour their own family members, others could not find the words to explain why they had felt so compelled to make the journey. They just knew that they had to be there. The rows of heartbreaking messages placed by grieving family members on the gravestones of their loved ones will stay with me forever. They paid $0.50 per line to try to both capture the life and untimely death of their loved one and try to make sense of their loss. Someday, sometime, we will understand, Mother, was just one of the many, many heartbreaking tributes. Sadly, the lives of so many of these men who loved and were loved are already lost to time, and their stories will not be remembered. But while not all will be individually remembered, through the actions of an increasing number of family members and historians, many more will now be remembered and their stories passed on. And I discovered not just in ways we would have anticipated. I met two brothers at the Shrapnel Valley Cemetery who were locating and individually dressing the gravestones of every single man their grandfather, a chaplain at Gallipoli, had buried. The efforts they went to personalise each and every one of these gravestones and the respect they showed these men was incredibly moving and will also stay with me forever. For 100 years we have said the words, "Lest we forget," at the end to the Ode to Remembrance. But I, and I'm sure many others, have not always fully appreciated this solemn caution to us all. A caution not to forget the service and the sacrifice of all of our returned servicemen and women, and also not to forget the lessons of war. An anonymous Australian schoolchild's note at Lone Pine, left on the shrine, poignantly captured "Lest we forget" with the words, "To all the soldiers whose stories are untold, love heart, sending love and thoughts." So whether by action or design, the Centenary is not only providing an opportunity to collectively commemorate service to our nation, but it is also encouraging families and historians to capture and preserve these individual stories. And that was evident on Anzac Day right across the world, with shrines, cenotaphs and war cemeteries filled with wreaths, photos, mementos, newspaper articles and sometimes handwritten notes to their own relatives. But none of us can ever truly understand what our returned servicemen and women experienced in war. That is reserved solely for those who have been to war. But hearing the voices and reading the stories of Gallipoli veterans while walking the ground with my father and my brothers, the same ground my grandfather walked 100 years ago, provided us with just that slight greater insight into what he may have experienced. And on a very personal note, I hope that this has helped my father find a little bit more peace and understanding about his own father and the legacy that war had on him. The most emotional image that I took away was observing my father's silent contemplations on his own father at the beach cemetery when my grandfather first came ashore on that fateful first pre-dawn morning. So my heartfelt thanks go to the hundreds of Australian and New Zealand staff and volunteers, the minister's staff, the War Memorial staff and the hundreds and hundreds of others who made this possible. You all did an extraordinary job in another country and delivered all of us who attended an experience we will never ever forget, and for that I thank you most sincerely. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission also does an amazing job. They quietly tender equally to all of those who will never return home. The Turks' generosity of spirit in supporting our commemorations, an invasion of their land, says so much about them as a nation and really brings to life Ataturk's famous words to Australian mothers whose sons lie forever in their soil. So Lest We Forget means not only remembering the lessons of war, but also capturing and sharing the individual stories of those who served, so their families can individually remember and honour them all. And then, as a nation, we are able to commemorate them all. There is so much for me to reflect on. lest we forget.